Good morning, everyone. Could I ask all members of public jury, all witnesses, and our advocates to take their seat, please, as we start proceedings shortly. Welcome, comrades, to the Special Court on Intergenerational Climate Crimes. My name is Jonas Staal. I am, in my role as clerk, I now declare this court in session. The first case listed for today's hearings is the East India Company and the British Crown, partners in crimes against ecologies and communities. This court will be presided by Comrade Radha de Souza and Comrade Judges Sharon H. Venne and Ramón Vera-Herrera.
Good morning, everyone. The case listed for hearing before the special court this morning is East India Company and the British Crown, is against the East India Company and the British Crown. This is a case brought under the the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021. The East India Company was established in December 1600 under a royal charter, and it was wound up in 1858 by the British Crown. Why should we put the East India Company on trial 167 years after it was wound up? Is it true that the East India Company and the British Crown together innovated a unique governance mechanism to govern ecologies and communities in colonies around the world? Is it true that although the East India Company has been dead, the systems of governance that it established jointly with the British Crown has continued to expand and flourish? These are some of the questions that the witnesses will testify to in this hearing. I want to draw your attention to two documents that I encourage you to familiarize yourself with. The first is the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021, and that is on page 21 of your program booklet. The second document is a special court, the statutes of the Special Court on Intergenerational Climate Crimes 2025, and you should find the statutes on page 29 of your program booklet. We must inform you that you are here as members of the jury. In that role, you are a participant in the work of the Special Court. You are not an observer, you are not a visitor. We ask that you pay careful attention to what the witnesses say and make your decisions on the basis of evidence presented to you. This is a special court in more than one sense. In this court, you are present here as ancestors of future generations. You are here to represent not your personal interests, not the interests of your communities or your states, not even of all humanity, but rather you are here to represent all life forms, all beings, humans and non-humans. We invite you to reflect on those relationships the interdependent relationships that must exist between people and between communities and between all other life forms for this life on this planet to continue. The law that you will follow when you make your decision at the end of the hearing today is based on the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act. You will not bring into this court preconceived ideas about climate crimes or justice or legal proceedings or humans, non-humans, and such. Section 2 and 3 of the Act provide the definitions very clearly and the aims of this court. Please refer to those sections when you evaluate your evidence that you are about to hear. It is important that you leave the jargons that you have learned or heard outside the special court, and that you refer to the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Act 2021 for the meanings and definitions of words and terminology. The Act does not privilege human life over non-human ones or vice versa. Please keep that in mind. All lives have value, whatever their forms. This special court is required to bring special attention to intergenerational aspects of climate crimes as defined in the Act of 2021. Section 4 of the Special Court Statute sets out the tasks for us today, the judges as well as the jury. Our task together will be to determine whether or not relationships of states and corporations are by design set up to perpetuate crimes against ecologies and communities. Therefore, our task is to pay special and careful attention to the relationship of states and corporations as legal artifacts and their institutional design. If the purpose of social institutions are to facilitate reproduction of conditions that are necessary for life, if the Act of 2021 aims to build relationships of solidarity between people and other life forms, are the relationships between corporations and states as they exist today fit for purpose? That is the question you will need to decide. You will hear from 3 witnesses. The first witness will testify to the East India Company and their actions and the systems they established together with the Crown. The second witness will testify to the systems that corporations and states follow today. And the last testimony will be from the advocate for this court, who will report on how we understand the past and the present and their connections and continuities, if there are any connections and continuities at all. And after each witness has presented their testimony, you will have an opportunity to put questions to them. Please note that this is a court and not a discussion forum. So frame your questions precisely. Please keep your questions short so that more members of the jury have time to ask their questions. I will now ask Comrade Staal to call out the witnesses.
I call now upon the first witness, which is Comrade James Vaughn, a historian of the British Empire in the 18th century at Chicago University, whose publications focus on the early East India Company and the British imperial state. Comrade Vaughn, you have 20 minutes for your testimony, and in the final minutes, you will hear a bell.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone here for allowing me to provide this testimony today. I speak as a historian, and what I'd like to do is begin by talking about a common misperception of the British East India Company, which is that it was a purely private commercial corporation that eventually became a territorial empire on the Indian subcontinent, eventually being replaced in control of its empire by the British Crown and the British government in 1858. Rather, what I will argue is that from its inception, from the very beginning, the British East India Company was a public-private partnership, at the heart of which was a corporate-state nexus. That partnership was between the British Crown and the government on one hand, and the directors and shareholders of the East India Company on the other hand. There's probably no more famous figure in the history of the British East India Company than the man depicted in this statue, Robert Clive. Originally Robert Clive of Shrewsbury, later ennobled as first Baron Clive of Plassey. And his statue here sits in the heart of government in Whitehall, off King Charles Street, between the Foreign Office and the Treasury. Clive was a British East India Company military commander who became known for his success in battle with European and South Asian rivals on the Indian subcontinent during a period of global warfare referred to in Europe as the Wars of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. And Clive was ultimately the most successful military commander in that period, leading or providing the basis for the establishment of the British East India Company's political supremacy in northeastern India. Around that statue are 3 panels which are not pictured here, 2 of which describe his most famous military exploits at Arcot and Plassey. But the 3rd panel refers to the event depicted here, the acquisition of the Devani grant in August 1765. This is a painting, a later painting by Benjamin West in 1808, held by the British Library. What's going on here? Well, in 1764, Clive was safely settled back in Great Britain. But news had arrived in London of the fact that a war had broken out between the British East India Company and its factors and settlements at Calcutta and the then ruler of Bengal, Mir Qasim. And this war, this military conflict, threatened the East India Company's position. In fact, if Calcutta had been eliminated, the British East India Company would surely have fallen. But the British East India Company was not just a private commercial corporation. It was, in fact, a public-private partnership between the Crown and the government and the directors and shareholders of the company. And it was believed that if the company fell, that this would send shockwaves through the private stock market of London, the system of the national debt and public credit in Britain, and undermine the geopolitical and imperial power of Britain itself. So when this news arrived in London of 1764, it was not simply the shareholders and the directors of the East India Company that decided to return Clive with full autocratic and military powers to Bengal as Governor of Bengal. He was also returned by the British government, then under the control of Prime Minister George Grenville, with the full backing of the Crown, of King George III, and indeed the entire landed and commercial oligarchy that was governing Britain. When he returned in the summer of 1765 to Calcutta, the battle was largely over. Mir Qasim had been militarily defeated. But part of Clive's mission, part of the reason why he was returned by the East India Company and the British government, was not simply to settle the military dispute with Mir Qasim, but also to permanently secure the East India Company's position in South Asia such that it could never be threatened by European or South Asian rivals again. And for those reasons, when he arrives in Calcutta in the summer of 1765, he travels up country to Allahabad and meets the gentleman depicted here on the canopy, the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II. And they agree to the Treaty of Allahabad on August 12th 1765. And in that treaty, the British East India Company wins the Diwani for the provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, by far the richest provinces in the Mughal Empire in northeastern India. With the Diwani grant, the British East India Company gains the ability to assess and collect taxes, tax revenues, from Bengal, essentially a territorial revenue or a land tax, which is being paid by 20 million Bengali peasants. That settlement that Clive achieves, depicted here, is viewed as not simply securing the interests of the British East India Company, but securing the interests of this public-private partnership between the British Crown and the British government on one hand, and the company on the other. Let me say when that partnership, that public-private partnership, came into being. Judge D'Souza talked about the fact that the East India Company was founded in 1600, and already at its very inception, it's not a purely private commercial corporation. It's a public-private partnership between the Crown and the company. Why? Because before she expires, one of her final acts, that is Queen Elizabeth I, is to grant a charter to a set of court-connected merchants operating in the City of London. And that charter essentially gives them a monopoly of all English and eventually British trade from the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, through to the Straits of Magellan. So effectively, the English, eventually British East India Company, is given a complete monopoly of all trade, of all English and eventually British overseas activity from the southern tip of Africa through to the Pacific Ocean. And therefore, the profits that the company makes, the earnings that it makes, are monopolistic. They're politically constituted by the charter that Queen Elizabeth and subsequent Stuart monarchs, James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, give to the East India Company. In addition to the monopoly, the East India Company is given quasi-sovereign powers and prerogatives to effectively operate like a state in Asian waters. It's given the ability to exercise force, to develop its own military capacities. It's given the ability to maintain its own geopolitical and diplomatic relations. And it's given the ability, if necessary, to acquire territory and administer and govern those territories. So the charter gives it quasi-sovereign powers that are necessary for its operation in Asian waters and Asian countries. And in return for its monopolistic profits and its quasi-sovereign powers, the British East India Company shareholders and directors, who are leading merchants and bankers in the City of London, give loans and grants to the British monarchy, to the British government, as well as paying customs revenue on their imports from Asia. So effectively, from the very beginning, there's a Crown-Company partnership. In fact, this Crown-Company partnership is deepened throughout the 17th century because the Stuart monarchs, the rulers of England in the 17th century, are looking to create a royal absolutist state, a state that allows them to rule beyond the control of Parliament and the law. And therefore, they need a source of income beyond the taxes raised by Parliament to do that. And so the East India Company is not only providing them customs revenues, but the leading bankers and merchants of the East India Company are continuously providing loans and grants to the monarchy, so it does not have to call on Parliament to raise taxes. And in return for that, the Crown is continuously giving the East India Company greater and greater powers to exercise its influence in Asia. So there's a profound deepening of the Crown-Company relationship over the course of the 17th century. This relationship is briefly unsettled in 1688. That is the year of the Glorious Revolution, where the attempt to create an absolute monarchy in England is thoroughly defeated, and James II is toppled from the throne, and William and Mary come from the Dutch Republic to take control in England and eventually settle a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary government. The East India Company is so despised for its support of the British Crown and its absolutist efforts that it is briefly disestablished. A new East India Company is founded, and there's a risk of Asian trade being opened up completely to private enterprise. But eventually, the leading merchants and bankers of the City of London are able to work out an agreement with the landed elites in Parliament and with the monarchy of William and Mary and subsequent rulers. And effectively, they get the renewal of their charter, this time by both the Parliament and the Crown, with their monopolistic profits and their quasi-sovereign privileges. But in return, they take their entire capital stock, which is 3.2 million pounds sterling, and they give it as a gigantic loan to the British state. And in doing so, they help establish the post-Glorious Revolution national debt and system of public credit. In fact, the British East India Company is the second most important player after the Bank of England in creating the entire system of national debt and public credit following 1688. And that system of national debt and public credit is profoundly important to the British Crown and the British government because it allows them to project power overseas to maintain their maritime and imperial interests without having to tax their population too heavily. Rather, they can rely on the national debt and on loans and grants from leading merchants and bankers in the City of London at the East India Company to fund their immediate expenditures and simply tax the domestic population enough to pay interest payments in future years on that debt. So the British East India Company eventually is fully consolidated into the British order of things. This is East India House, which is the London headquarters of the British East India Company, which is built in the 1720s. This is a depiction of it by the painter Thomas Moulton around 1800. And East India House, being the East India Company's headquarters on Leadenhall Street, it's really important to understand, does not just govern Asian trade for Britain. It is at the center of a public-private partnership. The leading shareholders and directors of the company are leading merchants and bankers in the City of London. They are leading players in the system of national debt and public credit that exists. They're leading lenders to the government. Furthermore, the East India Company shares are the leading stock privately traded on the London stock market as a blue chip stock. Its entire 3.2 million capital stock is part of the government debt, part of the government system. And beyond all of that, its operating capital day to day is coming from the Bank of England, and it's repaying that capital through the fantastic profits it makes. For all of these reasons, that's why it's such a threat to the political order in Britain when the company's position in India is imperiled, as it was in the 1750s and 1760s, by European and South Asian rivals. Because if the company falls, it is not just the fall of a private commercial corporation. It will send shockwaves throughout the London stock market, throughout the system of public debt, and it will undermine the leading bankers and merchants of the City of London, who are key funders to the government. And it's essentially for that reason that Clive is returned. When Clive returns and acquires the Divani, his estimates are that the Divani will be around 3 to 4 million pounds sterling of territorial revenue, and they will use half of that money to maintain a bureaucracy and an army in India, a bureaucracy and an army largely composed of indigenous officials and indigenous troops. And then they will send half that money back to London, to the coffers of the East India Company, where they will pay out profits and dividends to shareholders and merchants, who in turn will be able to lend that money to the British state. So it's vital to understand that what Clive is doing here is not simply securing the East India Company's positions, its profits, and its shareholder dividends, but also securing the position of this public-private partnership and upholding the London stock market and the British national debt and public credit. There are eventually interventions by the government into the East India Company's affairs and its management of this new empire that is acquired in northeastern India with the Regulating Act of 1773 and the establishment of the Board of Control in 1784. But these interventions are not a government from outside regulating a private actor. It's the government renegotiating the public-private partnership and giving government ministers greater influence over the management of the empire in India. But nevertheless, it is fundamental to those government ministers that the British East India Company remain largely in control of the empire because they don't want to make it a formal government department where it would come under parliamentary scrutiny and greater public scrutiny. The East India Company and its empire in India only ever really come under scrutiny when there's a charter renewal every few decades. So it's vital to maintain this system of unaccountable power by allowing the British East India Company and the British Crown to stay in control of the empire. From 1784 until 1857, the East India Company's empire in India was run by the British government's Board of Control, the company's board of directors, and the sprawling bureaucracy that developed around them. This system of imperial rule was largely unaccountable in Britain and wholly unaccountable in India. In Britain, this imperial system was subject to little parliamentary scrutiny and public oversight, as its power centers were hidden away in the company's corporate headquarters and in obscure government departments. In India, this system was subject to no representative or popular institutions and few legal limits. Indeed, it could censor the press in India whenever it spoke ill of government business. The primary focus of the East India Company's empire in India, by which I mean the Company Raj, which lasted from 1757 until 1857, was to collect revenue and to use it to maintain a vast bureaucracy and standing army. The primary aim of the bureaucracy and army, which were accountable to distant metropolitan authorities and not to the Indian population, was to maintain Britain's imperial rule by raising the resources necessary to support themselves and to provide patronage, that is, offices and positions, for their metropolitan masters. Their secondary concern was to project British imperial power throughout the Asian world from Malaysia to Egypt. It was only their third concern to worry about the development of India and its population. Crucially, the public revenue was not primarily employed to develop India socially and economically, even though some British officials recognized the profound problems with this imperial situation. The fundamental structure of the Raj, that of an imperial state responsible to narrow oligarchic interests in Britain and not accountable to even a small section of the population ruled in India, made it difficult for these officials to do anything about it. And since I know for whom the bell tolls, I will conclude with this summation. Under this system of unaccountable imperial government, in which the state in India served British metropolitan and imperial interests before those of the society it governed, an extractive political economy took shape. In this political economy, short-term revenue extraction in the service of maintaining the Company Raj took precedence over long-term economic development, and with it, the resources and capacities of the Indian population. Under this extractive imperial political economy, India's public works and agriculture suffered, its pre-industrial manufacturing industry declined, and its economy stagnated. In 1857-1858, the Company Raj gave way to the Crown Raj, with the British metropolitan government's direct rule over India. However, this transition did little to change the fundamental structures of this wholly unaccountable imperial state. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We now move to questions for the witness by the judges.
Call upon Comrade Sharon Venne to ask her question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I just have one question. Prior to Queen Elizabeth I giving the shareholder charter company, the Crown used to invest directly in these kind of adventures, but she lost a lot of money with Rowell, and so she initially was not supportive of this company creation, but then eventually saw when it was she understood that there would be none of her money going into it, but there'd be adventurers or merchants within the city who would put money into it, and then that they would benefit from it, but not directly. It would be an indirect benefit. Would that be a proper characterization of what happened at the beginning?
Yes, although she passes away not long after giving the original charter, but her successors, her cousin and successor, James I, absolutely has that view that it's a way of little cost to the monarch granting a charter, and in return to allowing these court-connected merchants to have fantastic profits, then the crown can come back and say, hey, you have these profits because of this charter, which on my royal prerogative I can withdraw at any minute. So cough up the goods, and they give what are often loans and often also just grants, free grants to the crown, particularly when it wants to do things that Parliament doesn't like because Parliament won't fund those things. So it becomes a kind of independent source of revenue. It's a very mutually beneficial relationship in the early period because the crown at very little cost can grant a royal charter, and in return it can get this source of extra parliamentary revenue with which it can pursue projects that further its efforts to become a royal absolutism.
Thank you for that. Do you have a question, Comrade?
Yes. Well, already Sharon made her point. So I want to ask you, based on the evidence you presented, what is the main violence made to the people? What is the main breakage imposed to the communities and the ecological diversity by the East India Company and the British Crown? Can you summarize a little bit of this, please?
Sure, thank you. This is a new form of imperial state that had not existed before. One can say, if we go back to the picture I had up there, that Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor, well, he's a kind of autocratic, unaccountable figure. But there's really a really important difference, which is Shah Alam and the Mughal Empire, although it conquers the Indian subcontinent, introduces an Islamic and Persianate culture, they live there in amongst the people. And ultimately, the revenues that they collect, to some degree, they have to use to serve the society they live in, simply to keep the population not discontent. And this new imperial state, centered in the East India Company's headquarters on Leadenhall Street in London, its first concern is the state itself. We need to maintain this bureaucracy and this army in India because that allows us to control India, and it also allows us to send government of India forces and resources wherever British imperial interests are in threat, like in Southeast Asia, like in Egypt, throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And so the first question of the people raising the revenue, the first question of the state, is not the society over which it's raising the revenue, but rather it's first, how do we make sure that the metropolitan interests are appropriately served, that sufficient wealth makes its way back to London to support the East India Company itself. Then its second question is, how do we use it to project power both within India and throughout Asia to maintain British imperial interests? And then as a third or tertiary concern, it then says, how do you use revenue to govern Indian society? And this has immensely negative effects on India. I'm not claiming that India was a growing economy prior to the British Empire. I don't want to exaggerate the case, but nevertheless is a world-leading manufacturing center. It is producing textiles, cotton and silk, sought throughout the whole world. But now that the revenue is being taken from India, largely for the purpose of maintaining a bureaucracy and army in India and then sending money back to London, it's not being used to socially and economically develop India. And in effect, what Clive establishes is what's often called the unrequited trade, meaning you're taking revenue from Indian peasants to then buy commodities, cotton and silk piece goods, further afield China, porcelain, tea, and to send it back to London where it can be sold and make profits for the company and its shareholders and loans and grants to the government. So this system never really is asking, how do we develop the society and economy to create greater wealth? It's rather always asking, how do we service the interests, metropolitan and imperial interests? And even some liberal and reform-minded 19th century Company Raj administrators, they recognize this very clearly. They want to go out and reform. They want to create greater public infrastructure, irrigation systems, public works, improve farming, improve indigo cultivation, these kinds of things. But they recognize that there's always this drain on the wealth of the country because first, they have to be concerned with keeping the company's army and bureaucracy itself in power and providing it, and then they have to service needs back in London, both metropolitan and imperial. And so it really leads to the decimation of the textile manufacturing industry in India, and the people who previously worked in it have to return to the land as essentially peasant agriculturalists. And it also very much fails to substantially create improvements, transportation and communication systems that could develop India itself. So just to conclude, I realize I've gone on length. The train system, it's often sort of defenders of the Raj often say it introduced a fantastic system of trains, locomotive system throughout India. That system is introduced to move the army around. That's why they created initially. It's not driven by, say, the development of the railroads in the United States in the 19th century about connecting key sectors of the economy and society, allowing a growth of domestic communication and transportation. It's rather servicing the needs of the army and the bureaucracy. So a transportation infrastructure is put down to service those interests first and foremost.
Thank you for your answers. Maybe I would like to ask you a question as well. You talked about extraction of revenues from the peasants, and you talked about how revenue was extracted from 20 million peasants, and then the funds siphoned off to London, and then the stock brokers and merchants then lent that to the crown, and therefore, that whole relationship survived, which is all very understandable and clear. But I wondered what the response of the peasants was. How did they respond to this extraction, and did they respond at all? Thank you.
Initially, the East India Company imagines that it can collect all the taxes that are on the books, so to speak. It's unaware of all of the traditional structures of negotiation around revenue collection. It comes in and assumes, just like the British state does in Britain, it can collect all the taxes for which there are rates. And so it's viewed as extremely extractive. And there's a great deal of peasant resistance to this whole system that's being put down. And as a result, Clive's hopes that of those £4 million sterling, 2 million will be spent maintaining the army and bureaucracy in India, and 2 million will be sent back to London to East India Company coffers, they're very quickly undermined. Because basically they have to continue to expand the army and bureaucracy to repress local dissent and to better collect the taxes. And this becomes a very self-fulfilling cycle, where while the company's empire is initially in Bengal, to both put down peasant and local resistance in India, and to be able to fend off other Indian rivals, they continuously expand to control more territory, to collect more revenue. But then in expanding, they need a bigger bureaucracy and military, which requires even more revenue and so forth. So ultimately, there's a great deal of peasant resistance to this, but once the system is consolidated, right, there are reforms put in place that control the rate of taxes that can be levied and becomes more, let's say, manageable. But still there's local resistance, particularly from political and intellectual elites who are upset about the lack of representation. Because uniquely in the British Empire, in India, for this period, there's absolutely no representative system. If you were to look at the colonies of British North America or the developing colonies in Australasia, you would see representative institutions being developed where there is some bottom-up input into the imperial state. But in India, there's no bottom-up input. It's a wholly top-down process from a European-led bureaucracy and army that ultimately doesn't have to worry about representative institutions and it can even overrule or declare emergency powers against court and judicial proceedings.
We now move to questions for our first witness by the public jury. For 15 minutes, please limit your questions to 1 minute each. And if you have a question, please raise your hand. Judge Radha de Souza will call out the questions.
Yes, please. Can you use the mic, please?
Thank you very much. This is incredible. Do you have an estimate on how much value was drained from India by the company specifically, and how much was then poured into the enslaving Africans from Madagascar, please?
That's a great question. I don't have an exact estimate. There's no question people speak of the drain of wealth generally. Nevertheless, it's more, I think, in the quantitative terms of how great the drain is. It's more the question that the revenues being collected from the society are not firstly being applied to the society. Whatever one thinks of the states of the 18th century, if you look at most states, they at some degree have to worry about, because they're concerned with domestic discontent or they live in and amongst the people they're governing, the government to some minimal level has to worry about local discontent, servicing local needs. So the British imperial state is really much more than even the previous Mughal state, removed from the concerns and discontents of the population. But I don't have an exact statistic on the drain of wealth overall.
Yes, there is a mic here.
Great. Thank you so much. My question is, I was curious, recognizing that the framework of ecological crime is an emergent one. Oops. Closer? Yeah. Yeah, just to repeat, recognizing that the framework around ecological crime is an emergent one, and although you didn't address it specifically, from the vantage point of a historian looking now back at this period, I was wondering whether you could identify what you would call key environmental harms or ecological crimes and damages that were perpetrated by the British East India Company.
Thank you. Let me make a very general statement, which is it's an extremely extractive empire that's established, meaning because it's worried constantly about getting revenue extraction to be able not only to maintain itself, but to project power throughout all of Asia, meaning the population of India is having revenue taken from it to service British imperial interests throughout Asia. It's extremely short-termist and extractive. It doesn't think through or it can't in ways other states that are more accountable and representative can think through the damage it's causing economically, socially, ecologically. But more specific to the question of ecology, eventually the British East India Company, or the Company Raj, which is later replaced by the Crown Raj direct rule, undertakes massive deforestation of the Indian subcontinent in pursuit of essentially developing further revenues, to be able to find even greater areas to extract revenues from. And it undertakes a kind of breakneck deforestation of parts of South Asia, and in doing so, often disturbs the indigenous communities and cultures that live in those areas. And often what happens is this necessitates that deforestation is not just civil or peaceful. It often necessitates the British Indian Army itself, because they're disturbing, uprooting local populations coming in. And that causes even more greater revenue demands for the army to be maintained. And so it's a kind of self-fulfilling cycle. But you can see how it's extremely extractive and short-termist. It doesn't think of long-term development. And in doing so, it not only causes social and economic, but ecological damage in the way it pursues deforestation and farming development and so forth.
Well, thank you for your answer. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much. We understand that the Crown and the bankers in the United Kingdom did not care about the well-being of people in India. Were there representatives of the company that would have lived and worked for a longer period of time in India and would have made connections with the population and would have indeed have a concern over the area in which they lived for a longer period of time? Was that the case for some representatives?
That's an excellent question. There do grow up, there's a very good book by the historian William Dalrymple about these communities, Anglo-Mughal communities that develop, Anglo-Indian communities develop. And what's really important about those people from Britain or Europe who do spend a long time in India is even in their writings and correspondence, because so much of what I laid out here is simply based on 18th and 19th century primary sources where they're pointing out this state is really in no way in the service of its society, because even though the bureaucracy and the army are indigenously staffed, at the top layers, they're exclusively staffed by Europeans. That is, the upper echelons of the bureaucracy and the army, which in their nature are unrepresentative institutions, are staffed by Europeans, and they all live there temporarily. So you have a group of people that are staffing the highest echelons of the government of India who never actually live amongst the people of India for that long. That is, they're constantly transferring in and out back to London. Just to give you one example, the statue that I showed at the beginning of Lord Clive that's still up in Whitehall, that is put there, or is basically organized by Lord Curzon, who was the Viceroy of India for the British government of India from, I'm going to get the dates wrong, I don't have it off the top of my head, but late 1890s, very early 20th century. And he goes out and he rules it autocratically for less than a decade and returns and goes back. And there's just a whole tradition of administrators who just spend a temporary period of time there. In fact, it's seen as a way to kind of climb up, that if you're from a kind of lesser landed gentry family, you can go out, have a kind of greater position in India than you otherwise could, governing a province like Sindh or something. And then you want to come back to Britain, where you move much more up through the parliamentary and political structures in Britain itself. So it's precisely the fact that at its highest echelons, that those people never will return to live amongst the people they're governing. And that's seen by this Anglo-Indian population that develops. They themselves point out in their correspondence the fact that this state is so unusual because it is such at the top simply a kind of a turnover station from amongst British ruling class to go out and then come back up.
Is there anything on record on how Clive saw the Indians and the British saw the Indians? Were there anything that was said of how they saw the Indians as lesser than the British?
So here I'll distinguish between Clive and the British, simply because there are different views in Britain itself about essentially what the Indian Empire and its population are like. Clive himself has an extremely negative view, that they're essentially docile and meek. That's how he's able, I mean, I didn't have time to go into details, But when Clive is going to visit George III at his court, and when Clive is talking to Prime Minister George Grenville, and when Clive is making speeches at East India Company shareholder meetings, the way he sells them on the project of a direct political intervention to get the Divani and to have a kind of real political control in Bengal is it will be readily accepted because the Indian population is very docile and weak. It's been subject to conquerors coming over the mountains, like the Mughals. The British will be viewed as simply another in a line of conquests. But there later emerges, views in Britain itself of people who basically are aware of how extractive and destructive the empire is, and essentially are, have quite radical views about the equality of Europeans and Asians and so forth. And this particularly happens amongst 19th century liberal reformers and Chartists, working class radicals who have this view of the kind of that the kind of landed elite that rule Britain and have still not created a representative democracy have an even more unaccountable empire in India, in no way responsive to the population. So you see certain liberals and Chartists and radicals begin to articulate a critique that the kind of unrepresentative rule in Britain has an even greater character in India.
Can we take a question? Yes, you please.
Hi, thank you. I'm interested to know whether you can provide some other examples. So you pinpointed the East India Company as the kind of originator of this vehicle. What other examples would you say followed where other institutions were created that replicated that model?
Oh, that's great. Basically, initially, British imperialism or British expansion did not involve direct conquest of huge, well-settled indigenous populations, like most famously the Spanish Empire and Aztec Mexico. Generally, it initially was phased in, particularly as it moved into the Americas, on displacing indigenous populations and then directly taking the land and colonizing it. And so a colonial empire tends to have more representative, inclusive institutions because the colonists themselves would set up assemblies, make laws, etc. What the East India Company becomes a kind of model for is a new imperialism that develops in Britain during the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, and then again in the late 19th century, where empires are created in Africa and Asia, but not of colonial settlers, but rather based on direct military conquest, where the peoples are conquered and then a tax or tribute is taken from them. And that tax and tribute is first and foremost used to maintain a bureaucracy and an army that maintains itself and then serves the wider strategic needs of Britain and its empire. And that is established during the French Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars to a wider extent in Asia, but really comes to its own in the late 19th century. In the scramble for Africa, Britain is establishing in Egypt and in Kenya and other areas regimes like that, and farther afield in Burma. So it absolutely becomes the basis of a kind of state that conquers and extracts a revenue and maintains a bureaucracy and military that then serves kind of wider British and imperial interests, but doesn't develop like it did when it was a colonial settler empire, representative and popular institutions that basically are a check on bureaucratic and military authority.
There was a question on this side. Maybe the farther run. Yes.
Thank you so much. I just had two questions because you said that India didn't have a representation of engaging with the larger peasants, and would it be also speaking to the caste system in India, which allowed for some people to take advantage of the lower peasants, and with the British coming in, that helped restructure in terms of knowledge going to the lower peasants? And secondly, the role that religion played in the British Empire, like in terms of the violence of people being forced to convert to be able to access education, and how that kind of affected the East India Company to grow far and wider. Yeah, these 2 points. Like, so one is like the why India proved to be such a great target or a great accompaniment to the East India Company is because already there was a lot of deprivation of resources from the peasants in the way the caste structure and society functioned, which allowed for the East India Company to come. And like the middlemen of the upper caste in India who kind of worked with the East India Company to maintain the empire, and how that kind of changed with education coming in, which also was connected to religious institutions being set up.
Yes, thank you. The first question, obviously the British Empire or the Company Raj does not obviously invent the caste structure in India, but it does rigidify it and solidify it in a new way, because when it starts to develop law, it's the basic view of the British imperial administrators and judges is that that law has to be rooted, even though they're making the law top down. That is, it's not coming from consultative or representative assemblies. It's being made and promulgated top down from an autocratic state. Their view is that it has to be based on traditional society in India. And so as a result, they come really to codify and rigidify caste. They view caste as, fundamental to Indian social life, and therefore they think that they have to incorporate legal distinctions and aspects of caste into the law. So it's often talked about how they don't create caste, but they deeply reinforce caste structures. And on the second question of education, there is an idea that an English system of education, so-called, this is called the Anglicization movement, should come in to further education. But there isn't even really massive investment in education because there's a conception amongst, I'm talking here about the 19th century, or later 18th and 19th century, there's a conception that basically you don't want to interfere with the traditional society. You just want to basically collect the revenues and maintain your rule. And you don't want to interfere with the traditional society. So even the people who do want to introduce them a kind of English education system, most famously, Thomas Babington Macaulay talks about creating this whole English language education system that could be spread across India that eventually make it a self-governing society. That is something that the Raj is definitely opposed to, precisely because at the heart of the Raj is the notion that the minute it becomes more accountable to the Indian population, it will undermine the interests it serves effectively.
Thank you. Yes, just one. This will be the last question. Yes, your question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. A sort of two-part connected question. The first question is about, I'm curious about how all this extracted wealth impacted England. How was that wealth spent? How do we still see that represented today? And I'm also fascinated by the fact that this was a public-private partnership. And I'm curious about what that seeded for the future. How are we seeing that kind of private colonial takeover mimicked today? How is that continued today?
That's great. So the main way it benefited Britain was the ruling oligarchy at the time of the later 18th and early 19th century, meaning that insofar as money came back, it was designed to uphold the interests of the company, and the leading directors and shareholders of the company were leading merchants and bankers in the City of London and lenders to the government. So it immediately served the interests of the kind of not just the financial and commercial elite in the East India Company, but the kind of parliamentary and oligarchic elite in Britain. The secondary way in which it served the interests of that elite is because it became vast self-financing patronage resources, meaning now that you had this hugely expanding bureaucracy and army in Britain, you had all these positions you could fill, and those positions wouldn't be paid for out of British taxpayer coffers, but out of Indian taxpayer coffers. So precisely, we're now entering the late 18th, 19th century into the period of reform, where the landed elite governing Britain can't use the state as much as its own private piggy bank as it used to. It can't put its, seconds, if it has two sons and one cannot be the heir to the estate, the other son has to be put into a government post or some kind of position. India can become a place where that happens. So lots of people who are in the ruling elite in Britain will take positions out in India where you have, basically it's a self-financed patronage system because it comes from India itself. Overall, that's how we see it affecting Britain. It's not the case that the drain of wealth increased the wealth overall of British society. That really comes from the Industrial Revolution. But it is the case that it increased the holdings, earnings of the merchants and bankers at the top of it and the landed elite, who they ultimately were responsible to through helping to grow their estates here in Britain and provide them positions outside of Britain. So it was really a system, and I would stress this, that was in the interests of the oligarchic elite in Britain, and neither in the interests of the Indian or the British population as a whole.
Comrade de Souza, questioning has ended.
Thank you, Comrade Vaughn, for your evidence. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Please call out the second witness.
The second witness is Comrade Andy Rowell, a writer, investigative journalist specializing in oil, environmental health, and lobbying, senior editor at Oil Change International. Comrade Rowell, you have 20 minutes for your testimony. In the final minute, you will hear a bell. And the slower we speak, the better the members of the public jury will be able to evaluate your testimony.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, jury, and good morning, jury. Thank you for being here. It would be easy to think that because the East India Company is no longer here, that it did not leave a deadly, lasting legacy. But we need to think again. One intergenerational legacy that has become completely normalized is the intertwined nature of these colonial companies and state. And in 1886, 30 years after the events depicted by James, the Royal Niger Company was formed in London. And as with the British India Company, commercial and political interests were intertwined, interconnected. And Lord Aberdare, the British Home Secretary, became the new company's governor. And in turn, the Royal Niger Company was modelled on the Royal African Company, which was also linked to the British Crown. And that was run by the Duke of York. The Royal African Company had the monopoly of shipping slaves from West Africa until the abolition of slavery in the UK in 1807. And the wealth of the slave trade would flow back to London, underpinning many of the famous landmarks that we see today, say St. Paul Cathedral, or many of the buildings that we see in Liverpool or in Bristol. For example, the single greatest architectural monument to Liverpool's involvement in the slave trade is the Grade 1 listed Liverpool Town Hall, which still depicts an African slave and tusks on its side. And with the Royal Niger Company, this time the product was palm oil, and thousands of locals would later be murdered by the British Navy, protecting the interests of the company, which would be instrumental in the formation of colonial Nigeria. So that was the Royal Niger Company flag with the motto unity, equity, and ingenuity. Pax jus ars. And 70 years later, in 1956, the next product of extraction was oil, when Shell first found oil in Nigeria. And thousands of locals would again be shot, raped, murdered, as this time the Nigerian military and the mobile police force protected the interests of Shell. This is Shell's first well in Olabiri, drilled in 1956. So first slaves, then palm oil, and now crude oil, and history has largely repeated itself with the old Atlantic Triangle over centuries. The place of extraction of slaves, of oil, palm oil and crude oil, is in West Africa. The place of production of sugar, tobacco, and refineries is in the American East Coast. And the place of consumption is the cities of Europe and Britain. And often, as consumers, we are completely ignorant. Anyone know what happened to the Royal Niger Company? It was subsumed into the Dutch multinational Unilever in the 1980s. So if you use Flora margarine, for example, on your breakfast this morning, or Dove soap, you're consuming products whose roots go back to the colonial era of extraction. And as the policies of extraction, colonization, and exploitation continue, they have become multi-generational fights for justice by frontline communities fighting the intertwined interests of company, state, and power. The first recorded letter by a community fighting against Shell by the Ogoni in the Niger Delta was in 1965. That's 60 years ago this year. And they've been fighting Shell ever since. 4 years later, as the Biafran War raged in Nigeria, then Prime Minister Harold Wilson wrote that it was, quote, of the national importance that the Shell investment in Nigeria, which was seen as a major British interest, should be, quote, protected. By 1970, an Ogoni song, "The flames of Shell are flames of hell, we bask below their light. Naught for us serve the blight of cursed neglect and cursed Shell." A quarter of a century later, in 1995, the writer and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa was framed and murdered with 8 other Ogoni activists who became called the Ogoni Nine. And several witnesses later testified they were bribed by Shell to testify against Saro-Wiwa and the others, although Shell, of course, denies this. And the fight against Shell continues, and I'll come back to this in a minute. In the meantime, we know that in the UK, as in Nigeria, the interests of the British state and commerce remain completely intertwined. So maybe let's quickly look at BP and Shell. In the 70s, the British state still owned at least 2/3 of BP shares and had the former head of the Foreign Office sitting on the board. Skip to the 90s, and you get Tony Blair's Labour government, which was actually nicknamed Blair Petroleum due to its close links to the oil giant. So there's Tony Blair and John Brown. I hope you all recognize the bloke in the middle. So Lord Brown, person on the right, took over BP in 1995 and was known for his extensive Labour contacts. And days after winning in 1997, Blair appointed the ex-BP chair, David Simon, as the Minister for Competitiveness. And in 1997, Blair loaned number 10 to Lord Brown to do a deal signing ceremony between BP and Sidanko, a Russian oil company. BP took over number 10. Blair would later personally intervene with Putin to save the deal between the two sides. Brown would be later knighted by Blair and also made a life peer. 5 years later, Angie Hunty, Blair's closest aide, left Downing Street, and guess where she went? She went to work for BP. There remains an active door between the British state and companies like BP and Shell. At the time of Sarawiwa's death, the chief economist of Shell was Vince Cable, who would go on to lead the Liberal Democrats. Cable said, "My time at Shell was the most valuable experience because it taught me to look at the world in a very long-term way." So Shell takes a 20-year view on events and plans for different scenarios. It makes you see the world as a kind of large matrix. Which is curious, because someone else who used to work at Shell is Liz Truss, widely seen as crashing the British economy and not being able to outlast a decaying lettuce, stuck there by the Daily Star as she lasted, 40 days. But they are not unique as politicians. Amber Rudd, ex-Secretary of State for Work and Pensions from 2018 to 2019, is now on the board of Centrica, who owns British Gas, who maybe fired your shower that you had this morning. And then there are the security services. In 2003, soon after the invasion of Iraq, Mark Allen, MI6, head of counterterrorism, resigned and went on to join BP, helping to negotiate a $15 billion oil drilling contract with Gaddafi. Over a decade later, St. John Sowers joined BP 5 months after retiring as the head of MI6. Let's look at the interconnectedness of boards. In the last 5 years, former BP and Shell board members have sat on the boards of the Ministry of Defence and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, playing a significant role in shaping UK foreign and military policies. And it's not just oil either. In 20 years, the number of officials from the MOD who have taken up jobs in arms and defence stands at 3,500. The revolving door is just one way that you and I are shut out of this democratic process. And in a book on lobbying I wrote with Tamsin Cave a decade ago, we outlined how Britain's $2 billion a year lobbying industry has undue influence on our democracy. To give you a couple of examples, the third-party technique is basically where a controversial industry gets someone else to be their mouthpiece and speak on their behalf, like think tanks or front groups. And one nuclear lobbyist submitted its spread messages, quote, via third-party opinion because the public would be suspicious if we started ramming pro-nuclear messages down their throats. So instead, you hear someone from the unions. A decade ago, that was the M6 building, when the government was looking to introduce plain packaging on cigarettes, Mark Littlewood, from the ex-head of dark money think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, appeared on the BBC. He was attacking the proposal. Routinely would appear, criticising the proposal. What you weren't told is that the IEA has long been funded by the tobacco industry. And also the BBC was actually breaking its own editorial guidelines by not disclosing to the viewers or the listeners that very fact. The IEA and Tufton Street, the think tanks that increasingly have come under scrutiny over the last decade, not least because of their close links to the Tories, and also because of things like pushing climate denial or undermining health legislation. And Littlewood and Liz Truss were fellow ideologues. And actually Littlewood was nominated by Liz Truss for a peerage when she resigned, although luckily it was rejected. So whether it's revolving door, controlling the media, manipulating what you read online, the third-party technique, divide and rule, or just the old-fashioned old boys networks or members clubs, the intergenerational structures of power and influence continue. And finally, it is worth remembering exactly what the East India Company was and the Royal Niger Company were. They were private-public partnerships. And someone asked, what is that legacy? Well, PPPs or PFIs, as known, are largely seen as the most expensive method of financing government and significantly increase the costs of government. And there are over 700 PPPs in the UK, making it one of the leading countries in the world to have such schemes. And as power structures maintain the status quo where the elite perpetuate power, resistance has now become a multi-generational struggle. Babies not yet born when Sarawi were murdered are now fighting Shell in the courts in London for polluting their homeland. This year is the 30th anniversary of the murder of the Agoni 9, and civil society is gearing up for a series of events to commemorate the murdered activists. We all have a duty to remember and join the fight for justice. Last month, Shell finally sold its onshore company in Nigeria, leaving a legacy of pollution and injustice. Shell's leaving is now seen as a test case in how multinationals can exit countries without paying any kind of money for cleanup or paying compensation to local communities. And the other day, there was footage of a Shell flag being lowered as the Nigerian military played the bugle, and it ended the company's colonial rule on shore, Nigeria. It's still operating offshore, but there aren't people offshore, so it can get away with sort of pollution. So it ended 150 years. One flag came down exactly the same as when the Royal Niger Company flew on the same lands. And Shell is hoping to get away scot-free. And we here, civil society, we should not allow that to happen. And I'll leave you with two quotes. Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, "The struggle of humanity against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." And as Ken Saro-Wiwa once said before he died, "I might be dead, but the struggle continues." And I would argue it's up to everyone in this room to continue the struggle for justice. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. We now move to questions for the witness by the judges for 15 minutes.
Comrade Ramón, do you have a question?
Well, yes, thank you very much for your testimony. Perhaps this may seem a rhetorical question, but it's not. I want you to take it literal. What is the main purpose of recounting all the historical details you have told us about? What is the value for the future of historical narrations and connections as you have made? Because I think it's really important for all of us to understand what is the main heart, the main core of all this recounting.
Yeah, I think, increasingly, as I was trying to say, just for anyone who's, involved in activism, writing, journalism.
Comrades, could you stand
Sorry.
to give your testimony?
They become multi-generational struggles. And to understand the now, we have to look at the past. We have to understand how these systems of power and structures of power were formed, came together, and have stayed powerful over generations. And, you know, if you look at something like Bhopal or the case against Shell in Nigeria, all these issues, you know, the legacy is so huge that these fights now are multi-generational. So if we as a generation are going to pass the baton to the younger generation, you know, as they strive for justice, you know, they need to understand the history of that. And no greater will that legacy be over climate change, you know, the main focus of what we are hearing. You know, the climate change legacy for future generations and those unborn is just going to be horrendous, you know, on our watch. And so to understand the companies that have perpetuated the problem, where they've come from, and the structures of power that keeps them, you know, in power is really important.
Comrade Sharon, do you have a question?
Thank you very much. I come from a territory where oil companies are very active in the tar sands area of Alberta. But I wanted to draw a little bit of a link between how the East India Company created a system where they had all these board structures who didn't account to anybody for what they were doing, and how that's been brought over into this corporate world now, where you talk about Shell, but you don't know who the people are, the names of the people behind Shell. And I always thought it would be really important to make those names public knowledge so that people know that these are the people that they're not faceless, they're not nameless, they're not invisible, they're there, and they're doing things every day that cause great harm. And I don't know what you think about that, how that would work out.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, unless you've actively got, you know, for anyone in this room who's got a pension, unless you've actively got an ethical pension, you're probably investing in Shell or BP or an oil company or a tobacco company or an arms company, you know, because that's often where pensions go. Oil, at the moment, you know, the world still runs on oil. Tobacco is addictive, and I'm afraid arms stocks at the moment are doing very well. So, you know, so that's just on the sort of the finance. Often, you know, pension houses are big investors in Shell, but we don't know the boards. We don't know the chief executives. You know, they often are hidden, and you know, increasingly, yeah, they should be called out. Absolutely.
If I may ask a question.
No.
Comrade James talked about how the East India Company extracted wealth from India, and that wealth was then used to expand military and expand the bureaucracy to increase the repression on people. I was wondering if you could say something about this aspect. Has this aspect of taking money from the people and the wealth that is generated there being returned to them in the form of expanded military and repression, does that continue? Has that discontinued? Could you comment on that, please?
Well, I mean, so exactly. I mean, often, so if you take Shell in Nigeria, the profit of that money, you know, the profit Shell gets it taken out of Nigeria. So for many years, Nigeria was one of the most important companies for Shell, but through like transfer pricing and all these other things, the profit then comes to like the two host countries, which for a long time were the Netherlands and the UK. You know, Nigeria is seen as a case study in the sort of how not to exploit oil and the devastation and the legacy of that. The wealth gets extracted elsewhere, you know, and in the fights going on at the moment, say, I mean, many of the leading sort of gas developments in the world right now are happening in Africa, with countries still seeing it as a development model, even though there is, you know, history of basically problems with oil and gas. The money moving, well, you know, back to Europe or to the US, and then, you know, whatever happens with that money of, you know, the financing, whether that's military or whatever. I mean, in Nigeria, one of the most sort of horrendous aspects was actually, you know, it was the Nigerian military murdering Ogoni. It was the mobile police force, and Shell was paying them, and you know, denied paying them for about 2 years, and then we uncovered that they actually were paying per diems. They were supplying helicopters. They were supplying vehicles, you know, and they were trying to sort of argue it was not their fault if the Nigerian military was driving around in a Shell vehicle shooting protesters or raping protesters. So yes, you know, the money gets extracted out just as the oil is, you know, and the people suffer.
We now move to questions for the witness by the public jury for 15 minutes. If you have a question, please raise your hand and please limit your questions to 1 minute. Judge De Souza will call out the question.
Question here.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask, I know it's not your specific focus, but what about the oil companies and British militarism in the Middle East, in particular the Gulf region, and BP is sending fuel to Israel's genocide of the Palestinians right now. And just to follow up, can I also ask about their responsibility for global warming, given they produce oil and this is a major environmental impact?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, we've done a bit of work just on Gaza and Palestine and Middle East. We've done a bit of work looking at the companies and the countries that have been supplying Israel. And I could see you in the break if you want. I could give you the links to that. And there is an international coalition right now to try and hold. You know, we often think of people supplying arms to Israel right now as complicit in genocide, but there is an international coalition of people saying, no, the companies and the countries supplying fuel to Israel are also complicit in genocide, and submissions have been made to the International Criminal Court on that. And secondly, on global warming, I mean, there's loads of legal action happening. There's loads of community action happening, but it is one of the defining battle of our time, really, trying to hold those companies to account. To go back to sort of like PR tactics, and the companies knew decades ago that burning fossil fuels was going to cause climate change, and they basically adopted the tobacco industry playbook of denial, delay, and that's that happened for decades, and they'd fund people like Mark Littlewood so for years, like you'd go on the BBC and you'd have like someone like Mark Littlewood versus a climate scientist who'd written 400 papers on climate change in the name of balance, and you'd think, well, actually, no, climate change isn't happening, So yeah, tobacco industry led the sort of playbook. Oil industries followed, denial, delay, and then sort of trying to argue that they should dominate the solutions. But even, I mean, sadly, gas was kind of being seen as a transition fuel to renewables. But since Trump's come into power, now the oil industry is like, hey, we're no longer a transition fuel. We are here to stay. They're completely emboldened right now, I'm afraid.
Any other questions? Yes, there.
Both of your statements. As I understand from theirs, the imperial colonialism has never left us, but rather shapeshifted under the name of a private sector. And where does the oil companies financing the war come into link of all these conversations going? Because they're actually taking the taxes from Nigeria and us from buying the oil from London, and then those money is going to another country and fighting for another cause, and with all of our power and all of the labor exploitations.
Yeah, I mean, it's go back, like in Nigeria for a long time, as I say, like Shell, most of the profit has left Nigeria, you know, and all these multinational kind of structures are, you know, if you look at sort of like the budgets recently, you know, there's a sort of huge sort of grassroots pressure for like actually, you know, why isn't there a sort of a tax on the oil, you know, like on the fossil fuel companies? Why isn't there a tax on all these multinational companies who do shape, you know, they just move profit around, you know, often, you know, people now say like a company like Shell or a company, even a tobacco company, basically they're making more money moving money than they are moving oil, you know, and you know they've got very, very sophisticated kind of like accountants departments. I mean, we've done quite a lot of work on British American tobacco, and if you look at the convoluted structure of BAT, you know, and how many, like you've got sort of about, even in London, there's about 7 companies just based in London, based in the HQ, moving money around them, but with they've got no employees. But like, you know, and so, you know, so it's billions in profit that just, you know, just disappear basically, or avoided through tax havens. You know, one of the biggest register of international companies is in Zug in Switzerland. You know, so basically, all, you know, many BAT has an HQ in Zug in Switzerland. So the most secretive principality within Switzerland to move money into.
Any questions? Yes, you there?
So do you believe that there has been a historical, misinformation stroke lack of information about the East India Company in order to perpetuate its legacy, perhaps even perpetuated by the state education system? And if that is so going forward, in order to pursue the activism which you're advocating we should do, given that we're in the age of misinformation, what is the best way of us pooling resources for correct information?
Misinformation over the East India Company. I mean, and its legacy, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, if you walked on the street in London, you know, if you walked out the door and started asking people on the street what the legacy of the East India Company, most people probably wouldn't know. I mean, I think it's, you know, on events like this where people come together and share stories and hear testimonies and see where things are, you know, the power structures that kind of were kind of invented with the East India Company are still basically going on. I think that's really important. I mean, there is a lot of grassroots organizing going on about trying to, you know, fight corporate power. Just to go back on Gaza, right now there's a lot of activism happening to hold companies and countries to account for supplying fuel to Israel. There's a lot of like grassroots actions going on climate change. I think misinformation is we're just in the foothills right now of how bad it's going to get with AI on generated copy, on generated images, on, you know, online has always been the sort of like cutting edge tool for the industry. Years ago, we were doing some work on genetically modified food, and we were tracking these 2 people who were going into forums, and they were like saying, "Oh, GM's great," and stuff like that. And actually, we realized that they didn't exist. They were like sock puppets. But we traced their IP address. One IP address went back to Monsanto. the GM company, and one went back to a company called Bivings, which was Monsanto's PR company. But that was, I think, 2004. So it's actually that realization that, companies were already manipulating what you read online, and I mean, I would say anything online, just, double check, triple check, because increasingly, yeah, it's going to get, with AI, I mean, you could read a thesis soon and it's, think it's real, and actually the whole thing's just been written by a bot, it's going to get really bad. Not to sound just depressing, but and the regulation is just not keeping up with it either, and images and other, deep fake images, I mean, it's already kind of a live issue. From a personal security perspective, if you don't want images, don't put images online on yourself, and then they shouldn't be manipulated. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes? Yes, at that end. Yes, please.
Thanks. As a member of the public jury, who will speak up for our comrades, water, plants, and animals? Should the human voice be loudest?
That's a great question. Yeah. Yeah. No, I know. Yeah, I'm not, I mean, just on the sort of, ecological impacts of climate change, ecological impacts of what's going on in Niger Delta, ecological impacts of what's going on in Gaza right now, or Ukraine. Yeah. Who is speaking for them? I agree. I don't know how I can answer that, but yeah, it's a good question.
Just to clarify that last question, we are here as members of the jury. We are the voice of the water, the plants, the life, everything. And you have in front of you a living plant, an indigo plant, which was used for trading and for profit by the East India Company, to remind us that that is what we are here to do, and that is our responsibility. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
I'd like to represent water, actually. I'm curious about, I've been doing some research into the origins of sort of Thames water here, which was absolutely connected to the East India Company, because Hugh Middleton, who was one of the founders of East India Company, one of the shareholders, also set up a public-private company to privatize water back when he built the new riverhead in the 1600s. So there is this relationship between the privatization of what was happening across the other side of the world and what was happening here in terms of natural resources. And I'm also aware that England's one of the few countries that has fully privatized water. So I'm curious about whether England, because it's had this very long history of public private companies, like right at the heart of its imperial ventures, is it a country that has more public intervention than other countries? Does it excel in that, Britain? I'm curious.
More public, what do you mean by public intervention?
Just in terms of commercial investment in, natural resources like water. Does it excel in it most? Is it very good at it?
I mean, I think we've got more public-private partnerships, I think, than any other country. I think most people will argue that privatization of the water companies has been a fundamental failure. And the way, again, that the public, if you're a Thames Water, consumer, you're now burdened with the debt, where a lot of that money has been extracted by private equity firms, and moved offshore. Whether we are, the problem is, I think, sort of like in the Thatcher government in the 80s, a lot of those policies were then widely replicated by other governments, thinking, oh, this is the way forward. And I'm sure you're seeing there'll be a legacy of kind of those kind of privatization kind of policies that were exported by fellow kind of like governments who saw Thatcher as a real kind of like economic sort of right-wing radical, you know.
There's one question at this end. Yeah, this end, yes. And one question here after that.
Thank you. I just wonder, you've been talking about how structures are being perpetuated from the East India Company to now. Should we move to a world where we do rely on renewable sources? Do you think the structures will continue? Do you think countries like the UK will still use terrains in the global south, say North Africa, where, you know, it's primal terrain for example, solar panels or wind farms, and still use those to take out the energy, but not give back to those countries?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think you know, there's growing examples of like carbon colonialism, whereas say with offsets, so so you can carry on flying, you can carry on doing everything you want, and then indigenous lands are being taken, like, you know, in Africa or elsewhere to plant forests, and the people are being moved off those lands. You know, you have to be really careful. Like, I'm doing some work on the moment in oil in Namibia, but actually there's a green hydrogen scheme in Namibia where they're saying, hey, this is great. This is, you know, this is a renewable technology, but then the hydrogen is going to be shipped to Germany, which is a kind of nonsensical thing to do from a hydrogen perspective, from a safety and ecological perspective. And also it's then trashing a kind of marine reserve in Namibia to sort of to build the export facilities. So, and there's, you know, again, there's a big case in Norway on wind farms, where one of the biggest wind farms in the country was built on Sami land. So, you know, just because it's renewable doesn't actually mean it's equitable, you know, because, yeah, so if you're not careful, you know, these power structures will continue, you know, and to go back to like sort of, you know, the oil companies want to dominate the future, you know, so are we happy with, say, Shell becoming the leading, say, provider of solar panels? Not that probably will ever happen, or the leading wind provider, or do we want a much more decentralized, bottom-up future where the power actually starts in this room rather than in the boardroom?
One question. There was one question here.
I wonder if we could bring it back to people as well, because when you're talking about the public-private partnership of the East India Company, or we're talking about the corporations today, there are people involved. And the East India Company, when we're talking about the public-private partnership, talking about the merchants, the bankers, the MPs in so-called parliament, and the monarchy, there was overlap between those three groups, and they expanded also to through intermarriage. And I would like some sort of discussion about how those formations of people who benefited at the time carries on into the present day, influencing the corporations and the world we see.
So the question was, you're calling for a discussion. What was, so the question was?
Do you think there is that link between people that benefited hugely from that period of colonization to the present day, the people that are benefiting today?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's a question.
Yeah, okay, no, absolutely. In whether it's, you know, whether it's in land and how few people own land in this country, and the sort of, or basically in hereditary peers, and how many of those have maybe got links back to the East India Company or companies that were involved in slavery, or business structures, or old boys networks. Many of those, structures of power and privilege, still exist today with, and you could see the lineages of people within that, absolutely.
One last question here.
Hi. So BP is the last or the most recent company to basically just come clean and say we're abandoning our climate change commitments, our net zero commitments. Can you speak to which countries are most likely to be impacted? Also thinking about what happened in Montreal with the Nature COP and the idea that, quite a few countries are sitting on quite reserves and feel, hey, it's our turn.
Yeah, all of them. All of them are going back on their commitments. BP went beyond petroleum in 1990, which is kind of, it spent more on advertising it was going beyond petroleum than it did actually investing into renewables. And so, actually, kind of Oil Change, who I do some work with, they do a report called the Big Oil Reality Check, and they basically look at the sort of commitments by all the companies and what they've pledged and what the reality is to try and hold them to account on their pledges. BP rolling back. Anything, anywhere they've got operations, on the front line will be. Maybe also specifically in Latin America, I think that there's some real flashpoints. I think I'm deeply worried what's going on in North America right now, and America right now, and an emboldened Trump administration, and and an emboldened fossil fuel industry. If you're on tribal lands in America right now, or even federal lands, it's just going to be a free for all. And it's going to be up to civil society to stand up, and fight back, because no one else is.
It doesn't work anymore.
Oh, right, okay.
I'll ask you later.
Okay.
Oh,
Ask
okay.
a last
All right. Yeah, no,
I
I guess the question is, you have the Congo Basin, right? You have Ecuador. You have different countries sitting on their own reserves, taking very different strategies.
Yeah, some companies are taking, some countries are taking different strategies. Some companies are still trying to invest more in renewables. But some will say, hey, we're committed to net zero. But net zero has become a completely meaningless concept right now. And if net zero means that basically what you're doing is you're offsetting your emissions by buying forests on land that just where an indigenous community's just been evicted to build, to plant a forest, and the whole problems with offsetting, they're becoming meaningless statements. So there are countries who are phasing out. There's a consultation on offshore happening here and new licenses. Britain is now trying to, is basically being seen as the kind of leader on climate, which in itself is a kind of nonsensical, really, considering what exactly, how much we're really doing. Yeah.
Thank you. Questioning has ended. I call upon the advocates. Comrade Swati Srivastava, who teaches in Purdue University, is the author of Hybrid Sovereignty in World Politics, a book on the British East India Company. Comrade Srivastava, you have 25 minutes for your expert evidence, and in the final minute, you will hear a bell.
Where do we see the British East India Company today? Its former headquarters in this city have been bulldozed, with not even a plaque to mark the company's almost 300-year existence. Its artifacts are scattered in quiet country homes and grand museums, with rarely an attribution to how they came into possession. Its wealth has been transferred down through generations, propping up both elites and upper middle class families here and elsewhere. Its forts, trading posts, and buildings in India are either ignored or considered a throwback to colonial style. But the strategies of the East India Company's rule live on in other companies. There was another trial in 1788 in London that was considered the first time the East India Company was put on trial. Philosopher and parliamentarian Edmund Burke, in that trial, referred to the company as a state in the disguise of a merchant. I will follow James and Andy to highlight 3 strategies of how the East India Company operated in a corporate-state partnership. These are strategies where public and private power blur together in a hybrid form, such that it is hard to see where one stops and the other begins. As James noted, the company began in the 1600s with a charter from Queen Elizabeth. This marks the first type of corporate state strategy in contractual relations, which involve formal charter negotiations with the Crown and later Parliament. Now, keep in mind that travel between Europe and Asia took 5 months on average one way. So by necessity, European rulers had to delegate their powers abroad. 10 months is too long to figure out if you're going to war. In the Indian Ocean, sovereign privileges for making war and signing treaties were delegated to ship captains, trading companies, and colonial governors. The East India Company was birthed during this time of overlapping delegated authority. The company charter was recognized as a trading monopoly overseas, but also featured many other sovereign grants, such as the right to raise an army or capture illegal traders or pirates, and also mint currency. In the British Museum, you can see some examples of East India Company minted coins. We think of government hiring private contractors today, and the exchange of money typically goes from the state to the company. But in the case of the charter companies, the company would make payments to the Crown in exchange for the charter and renewals. These took the form of custom duties, taxes, gifts, and also forced loans, which was when the company gave a loan to the government at below market interest rates. Some forced loans were never paid back. These formal payments tied the British Crown to the company's colonial enterprise in a financial synergy. This symbiosis meant that the company was too big to fail. It was bailed out at huge costs to the British taxpayers when the company went nearly bankrupt in the early 1770s following the Great Bengal Famine. This famine, by the way, we have no full accounting of how many people died, but estimates range from 1 million to 10 million people, a third of the Bengali population. For the company, the financial payments became the cost of doing business. Of course, the company recouped these costs from the riches in India many, many times over. You can also see some of these riches at the British Museum. But at times of financial crisis, these formal payments were a point of tension in contractual relations between the corporation and state authorities. And why pay at all if you can get away with free? So the company sought out ways to avoid making these direct payments to retain its monopoly and sovereign privileges. By the early 1700s, the company adopted a strategy of institutional relations with the state, the second form, which involved more use of political networks and the creation of the East India Lobby. In 1697, London weavers were protesting Indian cloth imports. More than 5,000 weavers marched on Parliament and attacked the East India Company's headquarters in Leadenhall Street along the way. Later, they ransacked the home of company's officials in Spitalfields. The sustained pressure led to Parliament banning the use or wearing of Indian silks. The company was caught off guard and formed a parliamentary pressure committee a year later. Shortly after, it recommended that company shareholders use their friends in Parliament to prevent passing of damaging bills. A decade later, the company was asking shareholders to use their friends in Parliament to prevent having damaging bills brought up in the first place. Again, it's more costly to shut down something that has already happened. So let's prevent it. As such, the East India Company started the tradition of corporate lobbying. In fact, the largest scandal of bribery in Parliament was related to the East India Company. In 1693, the company was facing a new rival East India Company. Thomas Cook was a deputy governor at the old company, who was also married to the granddaughter of the largest single company shareholder, Josiah Child. And Cook was also elected Sheriff of London. He wanted to be mayor, but failed. Cook bribed the Speaker of the House of Commons and other politicians to renew the company charter. The total bribes that we know of amount to £1.5 million then, which today would be 264 million pounds. As a result of the scandal, Parliament was dissolved. Cook was briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London before he took a plea deal and escaped any punishment. He went on to be a sub-governor of the Royal African Company, which Andy noted was the precursor to the Royal Niger Company and colonial Nigeria. Failing upwards, as we say. Moreover, the company was not just bribing Parliament, it was seeking a presence in government. The number of members of Parliament who were also company directors rose substantially in the mid-1700s. During the 18th century, there was no year in which there were not at least 5 MP directors in Parliament. This consistency is significant as linkages continued after MP directors were out of office. Some MP directors served terms as long as 33 years and became anchors for the company's continued relations with Parliament. Robert Clive, the governor of Bengal, maintained his MP seat for 16 years. This rise in MP directors allowed the company to shift to even more sophisticated lobbying. Compared to its European rivals, the company expanded faster to new markets when moving from spices to textiles to tea to opium over the course of the 1700s. the company's investments and networks also helped stave off the most restrictive reforms pressed by Parliament from the late 1760s onwards. Senior parliamentarians, such as Lord North, who would later become Prime Minister, negotiated directly with company directors and kept tabs on upcoming director meetings. These linkages did not just secure insider rules for the EIC or the company's corporate empire, but also served as a patronage network for politicians. Andy mentioned the revolving door between the British state and BP, or Blair Petroleum, and Shell, including the interwoven webs of who sits on corporate boards. One can then say the East India Company also invented this form of lobbying in this country. Finally, the East India Company engaged in the third form of shadow public relations, which involved behind-the-scenes side bargains. In 1741, the company formed a secret committee with broad powers to manage sensitive political business, such as managing its Carnatic wars with the French East India Company for control over South India. Secrecy was required because these company wars violated neutrality agreements between England and France. The company engaged in secret discussions with both Crown and Parliament on issues related to war and peace with the French. These shadow relations and negotiations reflected how European rulers used companies to engage in proxy war in South Asia, while officially being at peace on the continent. As such, shadow public-private relations were crucial for extending the empire through violence against rivals, using the bodies of the subcontinent. Secrecy also took a life of its own. The company had first created the secret committee only for the purposes of defining its political and military strategy in times of war. But within 2 decades, all major company internal discussions that dealt with its imperial functions were tasked to the secret committee. Previously, such work was delegated between other subcommittees. The British press had limited, if any, access to company records. The press, and hence the general public, were shut out of the secret committee entirely. Secrecy then diffused from company to the state. In 1765, the company assumed tax collection responsibilities in India and also faced heightened public scrutiny. Parliament wanted a share of the tax revenues as well. And so Parliament created its own secret committee to investigate the company's shadow dealings. However, the company's networks had obtained a list of the members of Parliament in the secret committee by the end of day. Moreover, the company made use of the new parliamentary secret committee to make appeals outside the more visible process of publicly petitioning Parliament. So, in this instance, what was meant to be a tool of public oversight turned into secret back channels between corporation and the state. These shadow relations between public and private live on today in furthering corporate power, such as the off-the-books connections between tobacco companies and policy networks that Andy mentioned. As such, the East India Company's long history leaves a legacy of how companies engage with state power. They may do so through formal contracts, or through informal institutional networks, or through shadowy off-the-books relations. These different strategies are not pursued separately, but at the same time. And the strategies of blurring the public and the private make company rule unaccountable by design. Contractual relations are used by governments to escape oversight by offloading what would have been state practice to corporations, and then claim plausible deniability. This is what we see with war contractors, who are not subject to international law in the same way as governments. The Ogoni Nine may pursue justice against government perpetrators in court, but they lack a similar venue against shell executives. And this is why the law is on trial. Lobbying relations are informal. With the power of agenda setting, it is hard to prove the negative. That is, what corporate oversight reforms could have been adopted, but did not because of the lobbying power. Shadow relations are by definition meant to obscure how public and private power work in tandem, such as when the PRISM program revealed big tech corporations sharing user data with governments of their own citizens outside standard legal channels. We may not see the East India Company's physical buildings today, but the company laid down the invisible infrastructure that allows corporate impunity through generations. From being too big to fail to lobbying, from public subsidized privatization to secret regulatory capture, the East India Company pioneered the most important strategies of consolidating power and evading responsibility. The company's crimes amount to making the original blueprint for extractive capitalism that has been copied endlessly to perpetuate ecological collapse around the world. The last time the East India Company was put on so-called trial was during the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the former Governor General of Bengal. In his opening statement, which lasted several days, you are spared from that, Burke argued that no government delegates away its sovereign power to corporations. He said, quote, "Absolute supreme dominion was never conferred or delegated by Parliament. Such a claim is a monster that never existed except in the wild imagination of some theorist. No country has wholly meant or ever meant to give this power." But Burke was wrong. Countries have given this power to corporations, and they have done so with full understanding that they can do more in a corporate state nexus than they can alone. It is not monstrous to claim a company state exists. It is monstrous how mundane this form of political power actually is, and how easily it flows down through past, present, and future generations to poison our ecologies. Thank you.
Thank you for your expert evidence. We move to questions for the advocates by the judges for 15 minutes.
Comrade Sharon, would you like to ask a question? Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah. One thing that stands out in all your presentation is that you reveal a lot of the secrecy around all these agreements among the Crown and the East India Company. So can you think about and tell us why is such a need of secrecy if there's a high degree of complicity between the government, the state, and the company? So can you tell us a little bit about why was it necessary?
Thank you, Judge. Sometimes secrecy happens because people are worried about the political and public consequences of the truth. Knowing that behind the scenes, the British government was making deals with a corporation that was at the same time complicit in the famine of up to 10 million people abroad, while at the same time putting the company through regulatory sham, might have been difficult for the British public to take at the time. There were a lot of regulatory hearings. People were dragged in front of Parliament and asked to answer for themselves. And yet, at the end of all of that, nothing happened. It may sound familiar to how some corporations are treated today, but revealing how interconnected the state is to corporate welfare, not public welfare, but corporate welfare, would make it difficult for it to have legitimacy in the eyes of the public. But sometimes secrecy happens not because there are some grand designs to hide from the public, but because that's just what corporations do. The idea of legal liability and exposures and NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, these were not just unique to how corporations function today. There were forms of NDAs for company officials. There were non-compete clauses. And sometimes it's just the way that corporations think that they have competitive advantage. And sometimes there's no grand reason behind secrecy. It's just the way of doing business. But no matter what the intentions were, the implications have been that people, if they know about the company at all, might know fragments of its history, might know some of the figures, might know the famine, but they might not know all the different ways the state made the company happen. And in fact, the British state would not exist without the East India Company, just as the East India Company would not exist without the British state. And the interwoven links of that sustained power and revealing that openly to us, the countervailing power, the public, outside of the corporate state nexus, is the role of this court.
Thank you for that. Do you have a question?
Thank you very much for your summary. I'm just looking at the legal underpinning of the intergenerational climate crimes, and I was thinking it was kind of an irony that the East India Company is an intergenerational profiteering process. But I think a lot of people don't see what's going on today has its genesis in 1600, and that these corporations operate, as it says here, as artifact or legal artifacts established by a group of persons with the authority to do so for the purposes of limiting their environmental, social, and legal liability. And I think we have to be more, we have to draw more between what happened back there, because I know a lot of people will say, well, the East Indian Company no longer exists, so what are you doing? But it actually does. The concept of it is what you have to think about, and how that comes forward to today. And so that the ideas that they did to limit the liability of individuals, even the Crown, now is manifesting today in all these other companies who hide behind the corporate structure, but also state governments who actively support that by putting in place laws that that prevent us from looking at what's really going on with these companies. And they'll say, well, you can read their annual reports, but their annual reports don't say anything. So these are structures that have been put in place to protect them. against any kind of liability, which is what the issues are here. And I'd just like to have you pull a little bit forward about what happened with the East India Company from our first presenter, and then what happened with the, I guess, the, what would you say, it was the legacy of the Royal Dutch Petroleum Shell Company, which operated in Africa and other places, so actually operates in our territory too. How these crown corporate entities are still operating. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. So if you think about 1600 when the company was birthed, the world was quite a dangerous place to start a business, to go halfway around the world and see what's there and try to bring it back. And as was mentioned in the earlier question and answer with James, Elizabeth had lost a lot of money on other London companies going abroad. And at this time, it was the Dutch and the Portuguese, right, who were the world powers. The English had to compete. And so the merchants got together and convinced Queen Elizabeth that they needed a new form of a legal person that could offset some of the risk that they were taking on these journeys to try to find trade and gain market share for the English against the Dutch and the Portuguese. And as a result of that, first the joint stock company and the way the stock was issued, and then later on what we now know as the Limited Liability Corporation, or the LLC, have the same origins. And the point of reducing the exposure of the company shareholders to risk, which at that time meant ship is drowned, you've lost your cargo, you've lost your men, and you will never get that back. That is what the risk they were thinking about then. And there were, of course, still pirates. When you fast forward this idea of the limited liability corporation and spreading that risk in a particular way in 1600 to today, what are the biggest threats that corporations face? Of course, they face a lot of risk. It is hard to open a business. But the initial justification for why a certain form of joint stock and limited liability existed is no longer the case. England had become the world leader in trade, and long after that, they continued the corporate model of limited liability. So it was not just about geopolitics and catching up to European rivals. At some point, the corporate form helped evade more responsibility, which meant the pursuit of profits without additional costs. And where we see that today, Judge, is in the comparison of how regular individual humans are treated versus corporate legal persons. If you go out in the street and you steal somebody's wallet, and if you're caught doing it, potentially you might be charged with theft. Potentially your freedom might be taken away. You will probably have a criminal record, which is going to affect whether or not you can have housing or employment, whether or not you may migrate to a different country. All of these consequences flow from what you might do out on the street. One block over from that street, a corporation can be involved in wage theft of its own employees, or just regular old theft, or it could be implicated in genocide, or it could be implicated in fraud, or it could be implicated in tax evasion, or it could be implicated in discriminatory hiring. And in all of these instances, not only is it hard to initially detect that a crime happened, it's not happening on the public street openly. People don't often know that their wallet has been taken from them. They don't know how to report that. And if it is detected and reported, even then, we have legal structures in place that create an asymmetry of power and knowledge between corporate litigants and everybody else. And let's say you even win in court and you get a decision in your favor. There are then appeals. And if you even get a judgment of compensation, good luck trying to extract any money from the corporations. They can dissolve themselves. They can form another body that is completely unrelated to their mother body. They can claim that they are bankrupt and have no money to give. A corporation cannot have its freedom taken away from itself. And that is a fundamental difference between how the joint stock limited liability and risk in the form of the East India Company and how corporate impunity continues today in the form of the corporation.
Thank you for your answer. I have one question for you, if I may. You said that the East India Company would not exist without the British state, and that the British state would not exist without the East India Company. I want to push that point a little. And maybe this was in the 1600s, maybe this was in the past, but to what extent can we say that about the present, whether it is still true in the present? And I ask this question specifically because in this country, at least, people value sovereignty. And in recent years, we had a vote on Britain leaving the EU, and people voted for it because they thought they were going to be more sovereign by getting out of the EU. So sovereignty is a value that people very much embrace in this country, at least. So given this love for sovereignty, I'm just wondering whether it is still possible to say that the British state would not exist and whether it would continue to exist as a sovereign state without the corporations. And what is it about British sovereignty that does not empower them to deal with these corporations?
Thank you, Judge. If you think about what a sovereign is supposed to do, what are sovereign functions, these change over time. Even tax collection was not a public function. It used to be a private function. Over time, the government took it over as a public function. Their trash collection, even if it doesn't happen sometimes, is considered a public function. Water could have been a public function, maybe is not. War making, supposedly a public function. Signing treaties, issuing trade licenses and commerce, and of course, protecting fundamental rights. But in all of these instances of how society is organized, you find that it is not enough for something called the public or the government to do it by itself. And you need relationships between public and private actors in order to have something like sovereign governance. There are extreme elements of this that can become fully privatized public functions. But even in instances where you think it's mostly a public representative or official or body or council that is doing the governing, some of the expertise might be provided by private officials. Civil society, of course, is a private group. Academics, researchers, we all help contribute to something called expertise and governance. And that's how it should be. It shouldn't just be up to select individuals who happen to be elected to know everything about policy. The difference, of course, is that the corporations have more access and deeper access to policymaking than other forms of private individuals or non-state groups. And it is this disproportionate access and power that makes it especially insidious when you have a corporate-state nexus. And what it means might be that the state is fully invested in the corporate welfare and is so trying not to bite the hand that feeds it. But even in cases where there's not this financial transactional relationship, regulation is hard to do. There are going to be political consequences, and even what you might think are easy wins. Everybody agrees that no child should go hungry. And yet, it is so difficult to pass robust legislation about child hunger. Everybody assumes that we should do something about big tech the last 10 years. And yet, in the US, where I come from, there has not been a single passed legislation addressing either privacy or monopoly or speech related to big tech companies. And so the connection between public and private in sovereign governance makes it difficult to try to have sovereign accountability when the same public and private nexus is governing either inappropriately or inadequately. We may potentially think about our public representatives as not being responsive enough to our needs. Clearly, voters have anger towards their elected officials, but at least there is an obligation between the governed and the governors. At least you know who your representative might be. Who is your corporate overlord? How do you call them? Do you go to their town halls? Do you vote them out? And how do you do that when it's not just a corporation, but a corporate state nexus? Where do we find them? Where do we protest against them? And so the avenues of sovereign accountability are limited, even though the public-private sovereign governance continues.
We now move to questions for the advocates by members of the public jury for 15 minutes. Please limit your questions to 1 minute. Raise your hand if you have a question. Presiding Judge Radha de Souza will call out the questions.
Yes, at that end, please.
Thank you. What is the relationship between the East India Company and the enclosure of the commons in the UK and the shift to monocultural agriculture?
So the enclosure movement, as I understand it, included elite politics. To the extent in which the East India Company, as James has mentioned, was or integrated into elite politics and propped up an oligarchy, they had a role to play in that. My own research is not able to give you full specifics on who, what, when, how. And this is something that I would encourage, that we are all part of not just the public jury, but part of the public research. The East India Company archives are available to the public to view in the British Library. And all of the comments that I made today about their meetings, their secret meetings, the lobbying, all of those are available to the general public to access. Some of them have even been digitized by a corporation that charges you money. But you can walk into the East India Reading Room just down the street, and if you're interested in learning about how the EIC might have played a role in enclosure, the archivist there would be quite helpful in directing you. But I do think the broader question is about tracing the legacies of particular kinds of abuses and violence that might have happened in British history. And while I don't know if I can speak to every specific instance of that as one person, my emphasis is to tell you about these institutional blueprint linkages. It's not necessarily the what, but the how. So not necessarily what kind of reforms or what kind of policies or what kind of abuses were the company involved in the UK and elsewhere, but how through the contractual, institutional, and shadow relations they might have accomplished that. And I am hopeful that as members of the public and the jury, and as you take on your own research on the company, you might use the 3 strategies as indicators. But thank you for that question.
Any other questions? Yes, that's at the back there. Thank you.
Thank you. To what extent do you think current companies, like nowadays, the companies, their corporate fail or their skill to shift responsibility has to do with the East India Company? For example, unlike nowadays company, East India companies cannot disband itself. They have no subsidiary companies. They cannot use their subsidiaries to shift firm, and they cannot, for example, shop around sovereignty. They cannot form and get a royal charter from Ireland, for example, for a better tax. So the skills to shift the responsibility nowadays are quite different from back then. So to what extent do you think is the legacy of the company?
Thank you. I think there are aspects of corporate evasion that continue on from the East India Company, including in how the shareholder meetings were conducted, the off-the-books conversations, how company pursued litigation against what they called interlopers, drowning them in paperwork, how they considered Parliament as just a way to meet their friends and to further their goals politically. These are all instances that we still see today. But the aspects that you were talking about in terms of the innovations in corporate forms, which we should expect, the corporation should not stay the same over the past 400 years. And so the form shopping that we see, and so Ireland is supposedly more lenient on tech companies than other places, which is why most of them are headquartered there to fulfill their European obligations. Or in the US, it's Delaware, right, for tax purposes. And so those examples of how you might constitute corporations and might create subsidiaries and subcontractors and spin-off might not have happened to the same extent in the East India Company, although, as we mentioned, there were different challengers, and there were mergers and acquisitions. But of course, we should see invention in corporate evasion over time. As Andy mentioned, there were also financial offshoring, as we saw in the Panama Papers, which of course also implicates the British Crown. And so were there examples of financial offshoring in the East India Company? Well, in some cases, the whole business model was financial offshoring, right? Take money from there and bring it back here, and then hide it away in country mansions where you can't even see it. So I think there are some legacies where the analogy might not be exact to today, but if you look deeper enough, you might either find an antecedent, or you might see, okay, so maybe this is why the corporations today innovated in these particular ways of evasion.
Any questions on this side? Yes?
Great. Thank you so much for that. For your reflections. I was just curious whether you could offer sort of further food for thought in terms of questions of potential reparations for colonial crimes, the tentacles of which have, like, as you've said, permeated contemporary corporate culture or the corporate state sort of nexus. And I was also thinking about the ways in which the legal concept of unjust enrichment has also been discussed in relationship to addressing these historic colonial crimes. What are your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think the question of reparations is always something that should be on the table. And the the point of reparations is not just to assign a value, a monetary value, to harms. There was a question asked earlier today about how much money are we talking about here? How much came from India? And no number would be too small or too big. If I said £1 trillion, would that seem like a lot? If I said 100 million, would that seem like a lot? But the question is not just about reparations in terms of what the money should be, and even if it should be monetary, there are other ways of making reparations. But reparations opens a conversation to reflect on complicity. And I think that is the kind of public work that needs to happen. So when you talk about structural injustice, it's not that somebody 300 years ago did something bad and now we must all, pay for their sins. It's exactly about the intergenerational accumulation of wealth that is concentrated in some areas and not others. And the people that might have inherited it did not choose to be born to a certain family, did not choose to engage in a certain type of politics. And yet, it's not about personal individual choice. The language of reparations uses structural justice because it's not about individual accountability. It's about how broader structures of harm and repair might happen, which also means that we have a structural justice to the future. And this is why we're here today. We are trying to be part of a future reparations, if you can imagine that, because our involvement as just being humans has already created ecological and climate collapse. And so, should our descendants be responsible for what we did? Not in a direct way. And this is where the conversation about reparations can sometimes get tricky. But certainly, they should be asking questions about what we did and how we went about pursuing more just futures, whether we considered alternatives, whether we paused to have an alternative court, whether we thought about our own complicity, even when we do not directly benefit from the wealth. Oftentimes, people do directly benefit. But the point of structural justice is that all of us need to broaden the circle of complicity so that it's not just the Clives and it's not just the BPs. Clearly, they're a part and a big part of the problem, as the court has been arguing. But we are engaged in this as well. And so actually, to me, the harder question about reparations is not about tracing back direct harms and repair and assigning monetary values. I think the harder political question is, how do we all reconcile our own role and our own actions and inactions? And how do we repair that for the future?
Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you. I too was very struck by your statement that the British state would not exist without the East India Company. I mean, I think based on your research, that has an enormous general resonance. So, for example, you did talk about the weavers and the bringing in of the tariff against Indian imports in 1701 or thereabouts. And so what we have is another question following on is, would British industry exist without the East India Company and the destruction of manufacturing in India? And of course, this is very topical for today and future generations, given the destructive policy of President Trump echoing around the world. So the destruction of one was the birth of another. So this sort of interdependent economic extraction was also generating very different paths of industrial underdevelopment or development.
Exactly. And that was a question that was asked to James about the connection between how capital is used in this country. And I think, even though we know that industrial enterprise in England and then later Britain was already well underway in various forms, where did the money come from? And one of the strongest arguments that people make about reparations is that the East India Company started out for commerce. They were actually sending money to the East, gold and silver, right? And that's actually one of the reasons why they needed the charter, because it was illegal to export gold and silver. It was also illegal to trade with non-Christians, but that was another reason for the charter. And so money was actually flowing from the West to the East. It was a commercial transaction. And when did that flip and become extractive, right? When did we go from money flowing from one way to the other in a fair exchange of goods to becoming an extractive relationship and assuming tax collection over the Bengalis? And initially, actually, that was what drove me to the archives. I wanted to find the extractive moment in the company records. And even though I have read a lot of these company records, I could not find the moment the shareholders decided, yeah, now we'll go for it. And now we will not even give them the money, right? Because there is no one extractive moment. It builds over time. But what was important was there was a flip and the capital flows reversed. And they stopped going from the West to the East, and they went from the East to the West. And of course, when capital flows reverse, that means there's a drain out from India, which is one thing we could calculate. But it also means that money is now being injected into capital markets in the UK. It means that the credit system can be established in a way that Andy was talking about, or James had also mentioned that. But it also means that even if the East India Company directors were not creating a manufacturing plant in London themselves, they were behind the capital infusion in London generally. And so it's in that sense that we talk about kickstarting the Industrial Revolution from colonial wealth. And how we measure that is incalculable, the kind of wealth generation that might have happened from that. And that could have then happened in India if the manufacturing there was not stopped to switch to agriculture, right? So there are interconnections between the mobility of capital, colonial extraction, the availability of capital for investment at home, all of that in a zero-sum extractive relationship with what was happening in India.
Thank you for that. I think there was one question here behind. Can you please keep it very short because we have very little time now? Thank you.
Thank you. This is really interesting. So my question is, we live in a time where it feels like our basic functions of government, policing, healthcare, defense, are being provided not only by private corporations, but by black box artificial intelligence systems run by private corporations. So I was wondering, how do you think this state corporation nexus, these public-private enterprises, how do you think the nature of them, do you think the shape of them has changed with AI? Do you think it's going to change into the 21st century? Thank you.
Well, that's what my next book is about. So you can see why, if you are interested in the East India Company, you might care about big tech. But the question that you posed about black box algorithms, which means that these are systems that are difficult for us to understand what is happening inside of them. They're literally a black box. You cannot see inside a black box. So if you think about corporations and secrecy, as was the question from the judge about what is the purpose of secrecy and why are corporations secretive? To avoid accountability, to bring down the cost of doing business. So you have, those are already opaque systems. It's hard to find out when they meet, where they meet, who's meeting, what are they talking about. All of these things are difficult. So you have an opaque corporate structure already. And then you insert AI systems who are also opaque and black box For various reasons, certain types of machine learning, the computer scientists themselves don't understand what is happening, right? And yet we're building it anyway, we're developing it anyway, because that's where the new wealth is coming from. Data is the new oil, data is the new indigo, data is the new opium. And so what happens when you insert opaque AI systems and black box systems that are difficult to detect and hold accountable for decisions they might make that affect humans and non-human life, and you insert them into corporate structures that have also been opaque and non-transparent and secret, and they've had a long history of learning how to keep doing that better. It is a deadly combination. You have secrecy upon secrecy, unaccountability upon unaccountability. And this is why the connection between East India Company today are strong, because it's the double opacity of the AI algorithms inside of corporate structures embedded in state power. And that is a challenge for another court. Thank you.
We thank the advocates, and hereby we conclude Comrade D'Souza that questioning has ended.
Thank you, everyone, for your evidence, your testimonies, your questions. It is decision time now. But before we get into that, I will invite my comrade judges to give you some guidance on the criteria that you use for making your decisions and on some advice to you as members of jury. So would you like to go first? Yeah.
It is a matter of giving a little bit of context of what we are here for. And I'll try not to extend very much, but we think that now one of our responsibilities as civil society is to open more and more places to encounter and meet, start conversations that are pertinent and crucial. And since ancient times, the communitarian assemblies were such spaces, and at some point in history, the theater assumed this type of representation, this performatic attitude. So in those representations, in those theatrical representations, the chorus was the voice of the assembly, was the voice of the public. In this performance, as we are here, you as public are the juries, the chorus that we are talking about, that may affirm or deny what is being said and put in evidence. There has been a lot of evidence here and a lot of exchange between all of us. And now what we have tried as part of this panel is to formulate some questions as a way where you can answer by saying yes or no, because then it is easier for every one of us to arrive to some decision and to make a collective statement. No? So this is the situation we are here now, and maybe that can bring us some light as to what to proceed, how to proceed. No?
Sharon, do you want to say something?
I dropped the machine. I'm not very good on technology, by the way. I think when you're thinking about this relationship that was created back in 1600, it was created to do something to benefit a certain sector of people. And it was designed to exploit another sector of people. And when we talk about intergenerational climate crimes, it reaches across from 1600 to today. And you see the evidence that was given here today about how this company was formed, what its outreach was, and how it gave birth to other entities who also continued to exploit the environment and what in our language would talk about the creation to benefit a certain sector of people, but depriving everybody else, including all of the creation, from the gifts that were given to us. So in your mind, did you hear enough today to answer the question, has the Crown and these companies work collaboratively and hand in hand to commit crimes, not only against the human, but against the creation? And that we have to leave that for you to answer. I have my own idea of what I would say, but you will have your own ideas too. So thank you. Hi.
Before we put the questions to you, I just want to bring your attention back to the function of this court. You have heard a lot of very interesting things from the witnesses, from 1600 to AI, to BP, to all kinds of very rich evidence, I would say, here. But now it's the time to bring that evidence, to draw on that evidence, and to bring focus to the purpose of this court. And I'll just go over it again. In this court, the law is on trial. It is not Robert Clive, it is not Tony Blair Petroleum, but it is the law itself that allows generation after generation to produce the Robert Clives, to produce the Tony Blairs, to produce these people who continue these practices. So, is there something systemically wrong in this corporation-state relationship? So draw on all that evidence and try to answer those kind of questions. I also want to remind you that in this court, humans and non-humans and all forms of life are subjects of law, are beneficiaries of the law, or should be beneficiaries of the law. And we do not therefore make that distinction or privilege human lives over non-human lives or vice versa. So just keep that in mind. And also keep in mind the fact that what you are going to decide on impinges on your view of corporate personality itself, because that is the legal foundation that allows one layer of secrecy so that nobody knows who's behind these corporations and who's behind these states. And then another layer by all the secret committees and others that we have heard about today. And then on top of that, now AI and whatever. But at the bottom of that is a form, an institutional form, on which I would like to draw your attention to. So with those reminders, I will now ask the clerk of the court to put the questions to vote.
So I now call on the public jury members to vote on the first question that is put to you by this court. And that is, based on the evidence that you have heard, do you agree that the British Crown innovated a unique governance mechanism in the East India Company to govern ecologies and communities in colonies around the world? Is there anyone who did not understand this question? Should it be repeated? Repeated? Do you agree that the British Crown innovated a unique governance mechanism in the East India Company to govern the ecologies and communities in colonies around the world? This is the first question. I'm going to ask all those who agree to raise your hand and to keep your hand up until the vote is counted. Do you agree? Thank you. Yes, on the top, have been counted. Those who disagree, please raise your hands. I will now call on the public jury members to vote on the second question put to you by this court. The second question is as following. Do you agree that although the East India Company has been dissolved, the systems of governance that the company established jointly with the British Crown and subsequent states continues to expand and flourish? I'll repeat the question one more time. Do you agree that although the East India Company has been dissolved, the systems of governance that the company established jointly with the British Crown and subsequent states continues to expand and flourish? Those who agree, please raise your hands and keep them up until the end of the count. Thank you. Those who disagree, please raise your hands. Then we move to the third and final question put to the public jury by this court. Based on the evidence you have heard, do you agree that the relationship between corporations and states is instrumental in crimes against ecologies and communities in Asia and Africa? I'll repeat the question one more time. Based on the evidence that you have heard, do you agree that the relationship between corporations and states is instrumental in crimes against ecologies and communities in Asia and Africa? Those who agree, please raise your hands and hold your hands up until the end of the count. Those who disagree, please raise your hand.
On behalf of my fellow comrade judges and this court, I want to thank all the witnesses. I want to thank the advocate for the court for your assistance. And I want to thank all members of the jury for your participation and your attention. The court is now, this session will end and the next session will follow later.
This concludes today's first session. All video proceedings will be published in full within the month. The court will aim to publish the full verdict in due course, and this court will reconvene for today's second hearing, the indigo trade, the East India Company, and the British Crown, establishing agribusiness, destroying interdependent ecologies, at 3:45.